I'm excited today to have a conversation on polyvagal and education and so many other stuff that we'll be talking about today. With me today, my guest is Dr. Debra M. Wilson. She's a reading specialist and founder of School Moves. She's going to let us know what that is. And she's the author of multiple school materials and recently 2 books published by Norton. The book I have here is the Polyvagal Path to Joyful Learning, Transforming Classrooms One Nervous System at a Time. That sounds really lovely. And the Polyvagal Backpack Classroom Activities for Focused Joyful Learning. That sounds like focused joyful learning. We'll learn more about that. It sounds like really the best way to learn. Well, Debra, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here with you today.
Yes. I think school and education is such a big topic. And no matter where in the US, I'm from Saudi Arabia. I live in the UK and I hear all the similar issues. Teachers are exhausted. In a polyvagal lens, we'll say, they're stuck in sympathetic or dorsal. Children are stressed and frustrated and have a lot of demands and challenges. Parents don't know what to do. So it's a huge topic. We'll see how we bring that into the path of joyful learning. I just love that because we do really learn best when we are having fun and feeling good. So let's start from the beginning. How, in a short kind of span, what brought you to the polyvagal path?
It's been a while. I've been in education for over 35 years, and I interviewed Debra a couple of years ago on my Crowdcast. I do a monthly presentation like this, and just loved her book, bought her books. And we had this conversation going, and I asked, well, who's bringing this into education? And at that time, there were some people were starting to bring it in, and we just had a nice conversation around it. And she knew from Leanna Ray, who's a social worker, who shared with her the work I was doing with School Moves, that in many ways I was practicing polyvagal, but I didn't really know it as polyvagal. I really didn't know the language. And I think understanding the explicit nature of the nervous system really has deepened my work, so that everything I do is making so much more sense. I often say, 30 years of teaching, 35 plus years in education is finally making sense when we look at it through that lens of polyvagal. And so one thing led to another, and I wrote a chapter for Norton and they accepted it. And within 1 year wrote both these books. So it was pretty condensed. I pretty much went underground for my family and friends and just lived writing for a year. But it's been great. And we talked about this earlier, before we started recording, is that it's been personally meaningful for both of us. So not only professionally, but also I have a daughter who has Debra called it a constellation of challenges when she wrote the foreword. And I love that term. And so I've had to really look at her nervous system. And now that I understand how she's responding, I can parent so much better. So I feel like this isn't just for the teachers or just for the students. It's for all of us. It's for learning and living is how I like to think of it.
Yeah, I think Dr. Porges always talks about how to be human, and it's, about connection. It's really how to be human, and regardless of if it's in a classroom or at home or anything, and that connection. And I see you have 7 principles for joyful learning. And can you I know there's a lot of details in each one of them. Maybe we could kind of touch on few of them, and anyone listening, they could go to your website and buy the book to find the details, but just kind of to give an idea of what is it? What is joyful learning?
Yeah, I needed to sit down with that. When I went to write the book, I wasn't necessarily the expert on polyvagal. I used it and I really understood it from a professional way and personally in my own relationships with my family. But I really went down the joyful path of learning when I was looking at all the research and saying, well, how does this align with everything I know as a teacher? How does it align with mindsets and cognitive load theory and academic regulation theory? So I really wanted to take all those terms like regulation and bring that into the academics. So when I'm working with a student as a reading specialist, where are they going when I'm sitting with them? What is that relationship between how they're feeling about their ability to do what I'm asking them to do, but also how they're thinking? And so in the first principle is befriend your nervous system. And that is for everybody, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we cannot help students befriend theirs until we befriend ours. So the whole time I'm writing the book, I kept bringing it back to us as teachers. And what I'm seeing right now and what I'm hearing right now with teachers is that the lens is on the students and their ability to be safe and all of that, those things that they need to be successful when the teachers feel like they don't have the support and the safety. And so a lot of times I'm talking with people like this, and I say, we have to have that lens be on the teacher first. Yeah. And that teacher has to feel safety and connection. And so I wrote that book through that lens, that we come first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm not a teacher, but I look at it as a parent. My first encounter with polyvagal was on parenting, and I realized just what you said. It's focus is usually on the kids, and even more so on behavior, not even going back into what is causing that behavior. Then I realized the biggest part of it is me as a parent. It's maybe an overstatement to say there's no use of anything, but I know for sure from experience, any kind of behavior modification or any of those things that is done on the child is quite very short term, if any, success. And I have two children. They're both they're old. My eldest is finishing high school now, so he's moving on to college, and my youngest is 16. And it wasn't until I realized my own nervous system and how I am the cause, unfortunately, of dysregulation. And also the piece of that and I remind parents all the time, it's an autonomic nervous system, where this is how so that first of all takes out the guilt and of all the past mistakes. But it wasn't until I owned I am dysregulated and how I can befriend my nervous system that things starts to change. So I love how that is really important to, for once, maybe talk to the teacher and say, hey, what do you how you can take care of your nervous system.
It's very important. And I need to add also that for me, I get a sense that it does add a little guilt to teachers, because they feel like if they are appropriately dysregulated, that they're going to be causing all the dysregulation in the class. And I like to point out that students do come into our classrooms already very dysregulated from home, and we haven't caused it, because we can be very calm and regulated in front of a classroom, and these students can bring that dysregulation in. We support regulation for the student when we can be regulated. However, I want to really make the point that if a student's in my face and threatening me, my natural nervous system response is to become dysregulated, because my nervous system is experiencing that as danger.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
So I think we can't necessarily, I think sometimes in the language we're using for teachers, we're asking them to override that, and they have to still be able to be calm when their nervous system is actually saying, I'm afraid I'm going to get hit. I mean, there are stories online of teachers whose wrists were broken by a student just going like that to them. And so they are sometimes in this place of real danger, and they can't always stay calm and regulated. I think that's our objective and our ultimate goal. However, what I'm seeing is that teachers are handling, when we talk about ruptures and repair, you know, in the mental health field. I actually created this with Leanna Ray, a social worker friend of mine. We created this kind of continuum. And myths and mends are those small little things that happen all through the day in the classroom, and teachers deal with that all day long. But the ruptures and repairs are when somebody's threatening us, or they're throwing the chair, or they're really getting violent. And then it goes into even more the breach. And then you have to build where trust has really been broken. And we get more and more over here on danger. And what I'm hearing in classrooms today is that the behavior has gone from this myths and mends, small little stuff, into ruptures and into breaches. And that's where teachers are getting exhausted, because they're having to deal with behavior that in the past, somebody, like the principal, somebody would have come in, taken them out of the classroom for them and dealt with it. But we're having a bit of a gap, I think, between what we really know with neuroscience, relational neuroscience, and that need for connection, those students' needs for safety, and the reality right now of behavior. And there's a little bit of a glitch between what we know we need to do, but the support we're needing all the way up through parents, school boards, and everybody to embrace this type of approach, and still knowing that we're going to be safe and not have to deal with all of this. Like, it's not realistic for us to pull them out and have a little recap and connect when you've got 30 other students in your classroom. So I'm trying to be the voice of reality, understanding and writing from a point of Polyvagal's really good stuff, and relational neuroscience is really good stuff. And reality also, and that's one of my chapters, right? I have resilience and reality. I talk about, and this is the reality. And where do we go from here? Where do we blend these two together?
Yeah, I think, again, what you're saying really also with parenting, because I think we're in the whole world we're still recovering. I don't know if we have, hopefully we'll recover soon, but the last 3 years were a very stressful years on everyone, parents, teachers, students, and all of that. And then you put on different kind of things which we started to talk about before the recording, which a piece that I'm personally now interested in. You work with teacher and special support system, which is dealing with special education. And we talked about the term neurodiversity, and what we understand it as a term that people have. What I'm understanding it now is people having different brains, or different kind of their systems deal with it differently. How do you see it? And we'll talk about Deb's.
But yeah, I think there's a narrative that goes on in our mind. So in chapter 1, I talk about befriending our nervous systems. I just do an overview of the states and views from those different states, and a broad stroke kind of overview. In chapter 2, I talk about safety and connection, and I bring in this bidirectional link between your mind and your narratives and your nervous system state. So I think the neurodiversity happens when we get into our narratives. But what Dana often talks about is we have this predictable nervous system, and we're not that different when it comes to how we're going to respond, right? We're going to either stay in ventral, where it's not all bliss and calmness like some people think. It's just we're able to handle what's coming at us. We're able to name and show when we're getting dysregulated, and be able to get, like Dana said, 1 foot in ventral. We can keep 1 foot up there. But if that doesn't work, we go into sympathetic of our fight and flight. And then if that doesn't work, down to dorsal vagal shutdown. And so what I found missing a bit in the conversation, the polyvagal conversation, was, as a teacher, I'm really into the brain. We're really into the mind and executive functioning and all how the brain works. And so I wanted to say, okay, so our nervous system states, the expression is story follows state. And then we have our story. And I'm thinking, well, I think it's a bidirectional link. I think it can go like both ways. And I think sometimes we can start thinking about things and we create this nervous system state, and vice versa. So I just wanted to bring that in and say, there's a way that we create our stories as well. So when we're doing our narrative is about our myths, our metaphors. How does the system support us? What is our beliefs and our worldview? So there's in chapter 2, I talk about causal layered analysis. And that sounds really fancy and like it's really complicated, just like polyvagal sounds fancy and complicated. But in reality, if we really hone in on it, it's not that complicated. So in chapter 2, it's safety and connection leads to motivation and engagement. So I'm really looking at how do we get students to be motivated and engaged? And when I'm working with them, and I worked with an array of students and neurodiverse students in my past experiences, I know that I have to help them understand where they are in their nervous system state, and I have to help them unpack their narratives. You've just been diagnosed with dyslexia, and I would want to ask you, when you were in school, did you have a go-to place in your nervous system when you were not able to do what was asked of you?
I don't kind of really remember, because of course I'm looking at it in retrospect. I probably didn't have the names, but so I have just about a month or over a month ago, a little over a month ago, I've been diagnosed. I finally went and did an assessment, and someone told me, okay, you're dyslexic. And then everything started to make sense, because and I realized how much challenges we're doing at school. Now, when you're asking me that question, I know I used to do homeworks with friends, even over the phone. There's always been this connection of doing things, but I think my brain have really adapted very well which is amazingly on how to do things. But I do remember after exams that I was exhausted, and I would put a lot of effort into things, but that would seem the normal. So so I don't know if that answered your question, but I think there were some coping adaptations that were really useful, because that's kind of the kind of things that's like, oh, really? That I was sort of an A student. So I did well at school. I read a lot. I love reading. So there wasn't anything, but now I've realized that I do adapt my coping mechanism. So I would sit and write and write and write over and over to get that information in. So a lot of these things do happen.
You managed to be a ventral learner despite your challenges. And in SCUMAs, I have a model called the energy expenditure model. Okay. And I ask teachers to look at their students and say, how much energy are they using to do what you're asking them to do? So if I asked you, how much energy did that cost you that you could put probably toward even being better at some of these things that you were working on, you learned your coping strategies, which is really important. And you were able to, chapter 3 is about co-regulation. And the principle is simple. Co-regulation comes before self-regulation. So you went into a co-regulating mode. You found your people, you found your team that you could say, hey, let's do this together. Let's work on this together. But in schools, what happens a lot is we focus on self-regulation. Yes. Almost all the objectives, if you're in occupational therapy or if you're in social emotional learning, everything is about self-regulation. How do we get back to the self? And I like to make the point that we need to co-regulate. The nervous system needs that all through our lifetime. Yes. And we have a sense of we co-regulate and then we quit co-regulate. Now we're in and on our own. And, we know through Debdaina's work and Bonnie Badenoch's work that we regulate from inside ourselves, outside in the environment, and in relationships with others. Mm-hmm. So I call that the IOB formula. I just that's how I've named it. Inside, I is inside, O is outside, and B is between. And that's really important. I created this learning hub, the Polyvagal Learning Hub in the book. And inside of it is safety and connection, which we talk about all the time in polyvagal world. It's access to interactive resources. And then it's also cultivation of skills. Because we can know our nervous system states and do all that, but we actually still need somebody to teach us. We need somebody to show us. We need somebody to mentor and model what's happening for us. So what are those skills that we're wanting to teach? And what was interesting when I was doing the research is that all these models, there's a mindfulness awareness model, there's a social emotional learning model, they all have this hub and there's nothing in the middle. So I pop the learning hub right in the middle. I'm like, okay, what happens if this learning hub becomes the center of all these programs that we're using? And we use this as the core. What access do students have to safety and connection, interactive resource, and the cultivation of skills? And can we explicitly ask the students to actually write these out so that it's not a guessing game? They know, when I'm feeling like sympathetic, these are my resources. When I'm feeling dorsal-vagal, these are my resources. So we actually, in book 2, I really go through, and there's like little templates that we can actually complete, you know, so that we know that we have, as students and as teachers and parents, we have access first to that learning hub, and then that kind of can inform everything else we're doing.
Yeah, it's, I think we're co-regulating all the time, even because a lot of times some of my resources is thinking about people I love, or, you know, looking at the sky, even though that I'm doing it on my own, and it could be self-regulation, but I'm using, you know, flowers, you know, so I feel like there's always an element of co-regulation. And I think, just back to the neurodiverse, I think because of the medical model that looks at the nervous system, or mainly the brain, as the main component of the nervous system, and I think that's why it's in different brain processes that are different, you know, between what I'm learning now as a dyslexic from other types of brain. So I think maybe that's why it's called neurodiverse, because the model does not look at the whole nervous system and the vagus nerve that is all over. I don't know. Probably there's a better word, and I've heard someone say that they started to use neurodivergent instead of neurodiverse, which I think I don't like that, because divergent, that means there is something correct and this diverge from it. And I'm also wondering, now that I'm learning about myself, about school-age children around me, that, you know, it's not a thing if the schooling system, the educational system, values all sorts of intelligence or values all sorts of brain processes the same. It's because there's a highly focus on reading, verbal, math skills, which are the main challenges for a dyslexic person, and other things are not valued as much. That makes it a learning disability, or I don't like the word disability. I don't know, that's it, just it's a learning challenge because of the environment. It's not because there's something wrong. And I also, one thing we talked about this finding a label and diagnosis. And I was, to be in all honesty, before I got my own diagnosis, and it's like, do we really need that diagnosis and labels? And I was actually surprised by how good it felt to finally someone telling me, this is your learning profile, this is how your brain works, this is what's going on, and all these symptoms we call dyslexia. And I felt like, oh yeah. So I've been for 43 years fighting with my brain, wanting to do things differently, thinking I'm doing something wrong and I'm not good enough. And it's just, my brain works this way. So it felt like, okay, so this is
return to safety and connection within yourself.
Exactly. And that's the biggest piece for me, is like, stop. I have been with polyvagal theory and, you know, befriending my nervous system. I have been doing that in ways of finding like how I could do tasks better for me and how I can find the safety. But with that, you named it, another level of safety within my with my brain. My brain is not working against me, it's working with me. And I know you've talked about an experience that you had with your daughter about the same thing.
Yeah, just understanding where she, when we started getting the labels for her, I started to be able to look up different, well, what is Russell-Silver syndrome? What is microcephaly? I mean, where's cerebral palsy? She had so much going on, but those labels did help. And also, you don't get funding, and you don't get, well, funding as they get older with the state. You get some financial support in terms of she's just moved into her own apartment, and now there's attendant care is being paid for. She's getting habilitation care. She really wanted to grow up. She's 27, turned 27 on Saturday. She really wanted to move out, but she's got this 27-year-old battling a 7-year-old, but she still likes her Minions and her cartoons, and it's a real challenge where she's come a long ways, and I want her to keep growing. However, the polyvagal, all the language, and it really has helped me the whole time she's moving out. She's starting to cry. She's starting to get scared. She's wanting to move back in. So I kept bringing her back to safety and connection. I kept, now she spends one night a week here. She wanted her own bed here though, too. So I bought her a twin bed, and I have that here for her so she can see, oh, she still has that safety and she still has that support of her mother. And it really had helped me with this next transition in her life. It's just so wise, the polyvagal theory and the science underneath it, and really starting with that place of safety and connection. It's just, and those labels, I say, if they make you feel safer, more connected, if they make you become a ventral learner or move into ventral, then that's okay. And I know there's a whole controversy out there around labels. Do we even use them? Why do we need them? Why do we call somebody ADHD? For some people, understanding that that's what they have helps them to get the resources they need, because there's a lot of resources around ADHD. But if you don't have that label, you don't know that's what you have. You don't know to go seek those. And it's the same thing with dyslexia. Had your teachers known you had dyslexia, you had a pretty good situation because you figured it out, but so many students don't have those academic regulation resources. They don't know what they are and they don't know how to access them.
Yeah, well, that was back in the 90s. I don't know if there was any support or any understanding of what is dyslexia. And although I was in a very good school, but I think it was not as obvious, especially again, because I did well at school. So I don't think that, but now there was something.
You didn't hit the profile.
I didn't hit the profile. Yes.
People didn't know to look for it.
But I still know there's a lot of people, maybe in the US and I here in the UK, there is quite an embracing of dyslexia and ADHD and all of that. But I think back in Saudi, I still feel that parents are quite reluctant in embracing those, even going for an assessment. There's understandably a fear of being labeled because they don't trust the system that it would be supportive. And I hope things are changing slowly, but what do you tell parents if they have that fear of labels and all of that?
Well, I run into a lot when I sit down with them at a parent conference, and we don't really use that term a lot. I mean, some states are more on board with it, like in Oregon, all the teachers have to have some training in dyslexia. Ohio, some places are more aware of it than others. And so I sort of tiptoe around, and I do watch their expressions and kind of where they're going in their nervous system. And I can see when it is triggering for them, because they don't want their child to be different. They don't want them to see them in any different light. So it's tricky, but I would encourage, before they actually get the label, there's 3 things that I want a parent to do before a child is diagnosed with that. And that is a good auditory processing evaluation, a good visual processing evaluation, and a sensory processing evaluation. Because those three, sometimes children have all three issues. And until we get those remedied and getting some intervention and support for those, it can make the dyslexia look so much more over here to the extreme. Sometimes they just go in and they get that diagnosis and they haven't gone to these other three. And I think it's really important that they do get those. I feel like they're the foundational processing skills. Does the child have that? As an example, my son had a difficult time reading and mostly comprehending it. And I took him to a neurooptometrist who really looked at when, put electrodes on his head and looked to see, did that information visually go directly to that visual cortex, or does it kind of meander around in his brain? And he had this meandering, so that there wasn't, like most people, this direct, like, okay, I see it, I process it, I know where it's supposed to, where I'm going to send it in my brain to comprehend. And once he understood that, it helped him to understand, okay, when I'm reading, or what are the resources I'm going to need? And we actually were able to talk a little bit more, because up to then he was very defensive of being in any kind of a reading program or me helping him as a reading specialist. He had a lot of defenses up. Yeah. But there's something about, oh, this is the way my brain's working.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this is making sense. So I have this anomaly, and how am I going to work with it instead of against it? And I have a course I teach, and it has 9 different learner profiles, and it's a really cool course. It's about, are you this type of? It's not the visual, auditory, kinesthetic learner. It's none of that stuff, because we're all of those. We all learn through all 3 of those. We all love. We need auditory, we need it paired with visual, and we need to touch, manipulate, and feel it, and we'll learn it so much faster. But it's about, is it a dyslexic profile? Is it a developmental profile? I have all these different types of learners. Yeah. Are you the perfectionist learner? Like, there's some that can't move past anything and they get so stuck, because if they can't do it well, they're not even going to try. So there's different profiles. It's interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because you mentioned it a few times. You said ventral learner. And I understand what you mean by that, but I'm not sure everyone who's listening would understand what a ventral learner is.
So I defined in the book ventral learning as a student's able to get that polyvagal learning hub that I designed. They have access to those elements within that hub. And if they do, they can stay in ventral. They can stay in that place of, I'm not really sure how to do this. I don't understand what we're being asked. But instead of shutting down or getting mad or ripping the paper up or throwing the chair, instead they're like, oh, it's okay to not understand. And I'm moving into sympathetic. My home away from home might be that sympathetic, but Dana calls home away from home. Where do you go? And for some of our students, a lot of them, it's sympathetic. They just get mad, or they get up and sharpen their pencil, or they go to the bathroom. They're like flight. They're avoiding. And so I feel like it's just really important that access to that learning hub is what creates ventral learners. And I looked at Dr. Martin's work. He's prolific. He's a professor in Australia, and he has the wheel of motivation and engagement. And he names 3 types of learners. And so I looked at that and said, okay, that really fits with nervous system states. So if they're success-oriented, they're in ventral, right? That doesn't mean they know how to do everything, but they know how to access.
Yes.
And if they're avoiding, they're up out of their seats, or they're doing it just to avoid failure. So it's failure avoidance, failure acceptance. So if they're accepting failure, I see that as dorsal vagal shutdown. And how do we keep students in that ventral space? It's through that learning hub. It's through knowing, absolutely having that available, safety and connection, their interactive resources. They know what skills they need. And so somehow you were able to kind of hang out in that learning hub, even though nobody told you how to do it. You figured it out.
Yeah, and I think so. I come from a somatic kind of embodiment coaching background. That's what, and then parenting led me to the polyvagal, and then what I felt with reading and understanding it. I haven't read Dr. Porges' book. It's just gotten completely over my head. I love Debra and how she makes the information accessible.
Right.
But I felt like, yeah, so these are the scientific terms to things that I have felt already. And that's why I feel like the polyvagal theory is an intuitive model that a lot of modalities in different dance movement therapy, in so many different things, probably we talked about Montessori of would have that kind of being informed. So it's really about how we deal with things, and the polyvagal theory just putting the scientific name so we can have a unified terminology, and it's backed with science, and it feels like, yeah, this is what usually would happen when you're talking about the learning profile. Yeah, sometimes I'm learning something and I'm encouraged to try, and sometimes I'm kind of annoyed and get out, and then I just can't do it. And those are the different states. I never kind of connected them, but yeah.
That's what's neat. When I was writing the book, they just sort of fell in line. They just fell in line with nervous system states. That leads me to cognitive load theory. Mm-hmm. Cognitive load is how much inside, outside, and between is going on that helps us or hinders us in learning. There's a lot of cognitive load right now. We're in this conversation. I'm listening to you. I'm trying to respond back. And I'm also trying to remember all the things I've written in the book and the order that they're in and the different principles. And it's right now, that's a lot of cognitive load. And so it's like you start feeling yourself going down those runs of that ladder. And Debra has that ladder. She uses that autonomic ladder. So we want to be able to just keep going back up and saying, okay, but how do I return? What are my resources to return back to ventral and to learn? That's the whole essence of the joyful path. That's learning joyfully when you're not under cognitive load. When you don't feel like I can't think of one more thing. I can't do, because we move really fast in education. We move on to the next and the next and the next thing. And some of these children, young adults, are still back here. You know, they're still processing what happened in the morning, and you're already into the afternoon and they're still processing over here. So I looked at mindsets. We have growth mindset and we have fixed, right? Dweck's work. And I said, well, is there something in between that black and white duality? Is there something where we can say it's evolving? And like you were saying, if you have your resources and you feel pretty good about what you're going to do, you can evolve into growth. But if not, you're going to shut down into, I just can't do it. It's a fixed mindset. But I don't think it's like either on or off.
Yeah.
I think there's something in the middle, and that's where I use polyvagal theory and that learning hub was, let's put this in the middle. Yeah. And if we have those resources, we're much more able to get into growth mindset than if we don't have them. We're much more likely to go into sympathetic dorsal vagal, which is a fixed mindset.
Yeah, because it's even a survival state, there's less option, way less option on survival states than when it's in ventral. And a lot of things kind of is limited. And there's always self-judgment. That's what I noticed. There's the story, and talked about story follows state. I think it is story follows state. Just sometimes even I don't notice the state. I notice the story first. Yes. But in a survival now, I have that awareness. As soon as I'm saying, "Oh, I'm not good enough," "Oh, I'm not." There's a self-judgment on myself or the other. That's a survival state. That's a survival state. And that's the thing why, again, I feel with having that understanding how my brain works, and now I'm listening to, books about dyslexia, of like, okay, understanding how the brain works is like, yeah, so even, when I was reading, Einstein was dyslexic, and I was thinking, yeah, how awesome it is that I have the same brain as Einstein.
Your story has changed, your myth, your metaphor. So your metaphor is, I'm like Einstein, right?
On my brain.
This layer of our narrative story is our myths and our metaphors. what was your metaphor before that? I'd be curious, like if you had to have a metaphor before you had your diagnosis, what was your metaphor for your brain and how you worked?
It was a struggle of fighting, is like, why I can't do this. What is, I'm a failure. I can't do this. There's something wrong with me. You know, it's always that I'm doing something incorrect. And it's like, can't understand why. And with that story being played all the time, it also kind of overshadows the strength, the different way of looking at things. So there are things that I could do really, really well with this dyslexic brain that I have. I don't know, hopefully at some point we can, you know, have a different term to that, but it is right now in this cluster of processes and symptoms.
Yeah, and I like what you say about the strength-based. That's what we have to do. When Shalia had this small little head and it was in the 1 percentile, and I went to the neurologist when she was 5, and he basically said to me, I'd gone to other doctors up to then finally went to this neurologist that was highly recommended. And he just said, she'd been making really good progress. And he said, well, it's all a waste because she's going to return to a 2-year-old. And so it was, am I going to embrace that myth? I just, you know, held her hand. I write about it in the book. I do weave the story of parenting Shalia in the book. I just grabbed her lovely little hand, the tiny little hand, and walked out, and I never went back, because I want to surround myself with a team that believes. And that's principle 7, is dwelling in possibility and curiosity and believing that all these things are possible. And that we do from a ventral place, right? From a place of, we can solve this, we can figure this out. And I had to, whenever the school did all her testing, it was a 0, 0, 0 cognitively on everything, except 25% visual memory. So I went, huh? Okay, so I leaned into 25% on visual memory, and actually it's even stronger. It's so strong. So I didn't teach her with phonics like everybody says you need to do. I actually taught her whole word, because that's how her brain learned. She could look at things that she had 4 sets of tubes. She couldn't hear, she couldn't process. She had really severe auditory processing. So I knew a phonics approach was going to just frustrate her. So I just labeled everything in her room, and every morning, Shalia, what's this? The wall, window. You know, we just did this every day. And once she learned a word, she knew it. So I really went that. And then once she got an idea of that's that word, then I started breaking it down for her. Then I used these stretch bands, and we stretched out the words together. And I started to show her that these sounds blend. But, you know, even today, if she says, she sent me a text, she's nonverbal now. She was verbal, but then lost her ability. Part of the regression was she did lose her speech at about 12, but she learned how to text, and she loves texting, and she's okay with texting, and she can talk, but it's very hard and frustrating. So she's decided to text, but she sent me a text that said, I need new BJs instead of PJs. So you can tell even now she doesn't hear the in the book, you know, and you can do the look at my lips and all that stuff. But for her, I can see in her texting what she can hear and what she can't hear. So going with strength-based, anybody on the call who's watching this, please, please look at your child and say, what do they do well, instead of focusing on all the things that they don't do well, which we tend to do. We're going to improve what they don't do well. But with her, like she loved to play Go Fish. She loved memory match. Visual memory, she loved memory matching. So I taught her through Go Fish and memory matching, and took pictures of our favorite things, and we wrote, you know, sentences, and everything had to be personally very meaningful to her. That's the only way she engaged with it. If it wasn't about her, or a picture of her in it, or a picture of something she loved, she wasn't going to read just something random. So I think that's just really important, and I'm glad you brought it up, is we really, and when we look at staying in strength-based also, you can weave in those cultivation of skills. You can go over and weave in what do we need to improve, always bringing them back to that success-oriented place, to that ventral place of, oh, I can do this. I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's, and it's a different way of looking at the world. Really, it's, and that's what I'm talking about myself, and even with sometimes there's an over exaggeration. It's like, oh, wanting to be the champions, like, oh, people do really great stuff, and missing that there are challenges. No, there are challenges. And just as I started to go into this journey of learning more about myself and what dyslexia is, and I was thinking, it's something, could be as simple as, someone who's really tall who's have an advantage of getting something out of a shelf, but someone who is short would find sitting in a car much more comfortable. There's every trait, and this is way oversimplifying it, but there's always something that is good in something and not good in something, because that's the nature of things.
It's contextual. Deb Dana has, context is one of the cues of safety or of well-being. Is in some contexts things are appropriate, in other contexts they're going to look different depending on what we're doing.
So yeah, I just hope that the educational system, at least when it comes to testing and evaluation the ability of a child or student, it kind of expands to all sorts of brain processes of, it's not just, hopefully we get to exam accommodation and all that, but to much more of like how we can get those students to really feel good about what they do good, and not just because they can't read well, they feel that they're failures, which I think is really difficult to do.
And I talk about that in chapter 7, the right brain, left brain, like the vision and education. I mean, we lean to the left in the Gilchrist's work. He wrote that huge book, 600 pages on the divided brain. It's really great stuff. And it's, in education, we teach what we measure, and we're very uncomfortable with focusing on things that we really can't measure, because it all gets back to accountability and how are they, we've got the national report card and with other students in other countries. And there's just a lot around that. And I think sometimes people say, well, why is education so slow to change? And I say, well, because it's the whole Western hemisphere is left hemisphere biased. It's into what we can measure. Sure. And if we can't measure it and we're not testing it, we're not going to focus on it so much. And that's the challenge. Is I say in chapter 7, we have to find the corpus callosum between the right hemisphere and left hemisphere of education. How do we bridge, and how do we bring relational neuroscience into education in a way that feels safe?
Yeah.
For administrators and school board members and all these people that are voted into office, how do we make it so that that's a safe experience? Because we have so much division in education. It's just like the right and left brain. We have a lot of division in education right now. It's a challenging place to be.
And I think the world now needs more of that right brain kind of holistic kind of approach of looking at things. I think we've done, like you said, the scientific model of evidence, and it got us, the humanity advanced in so many ways with technology and all that. So I think now, in a way, it's kind of an evolutionary process of going into, no, let's look at how people feel and how people think, because a lot of, individuals with neurodiverse or ADHD or dyslexic or any of those, even with autism, they have quite a very high emotional and social skills. Maybe not autism. I don't know much about that, but there are things that are normally missing from that kind of world. So I think it's like looking at how people learn, how people feel. That empathy, highly sensitive people are usually, many of the ones that I know are ADD as well. So there are some traits that I think from an evolutionary perspective that we desperately need in this world of how the relational part of it. It's like, how do we treat each other? How do we feel safe? Like Dr. Porges was saying, how we feel safe in an arms of another. I haven't read the book word by word, but I looked at the different chapters and kind of to get an overview, but I'm quite excited to go and read it. First of all, it seems very accessible from what I've read, and very simple.
Yeah, I tried to make it through tell stories, and I'm still getting people saying, "Oh, it's deep," and I'm thinking, well, I tried to make it be very much looking at my career and my working with students through that lens, and kind of looking at a retro lens of it, like, oh, we were in this state, we were in that state, looking at bringing those stories in so people could relate with the stories. So, and I also do weave in my personal experience with my daughter and those challenges, and how much polyvagal has really helped me. It's probably the number one thing that has really helped me to grow with my daughter, to understand and not feel like, why aren't you doing? I mean, I always was pretty patient, but she would get frozen and stuck, and they're just, I now know I can look at her and say, oh, she's in a state of freeze right now, not sure which way, too much information's coming in. And we've already talked about it ahead of time. So we know. I actually did a little ventral map with her. Like I put a little sun, a happy sun in the middle of these clouds. And I said, so Shalia, when you're feeling like this, when she wasn't like that, in that state, when she was in ventral, we talked about, she texts me, these are the things that help me. Can I get my earbuds in and listen to my country music? She loves country music for some reason. And I need a hug.
Oh,
so she's told me that a hug. So when I see her, and I actually ask her, are you frozen? She gives me a thumbs up. It's thumbs up or thumbs down. She'll give me a thumbs up, and I give her a hug. And a lot of times she starts to cry like that. She has so much processing issues, and all of it's coming in, and I'm trying to get her to move faster than her little mind and body system wants to move or can move. So it's just made me much more empathetic and understanding.
Yeah, I think naming it and understanding what is happening brings so much clarity to and removes assumptions. And it is simple, but it's not easy.
Right. I like that. It's simple but not easy. That's a great
easy.
quote.
I had to read about polyvagal I don't know how many times, and listen to Deb, and listen to also to finally start to wrap my head around it, and then to experience it in my own life. And the more I experience it, the more like I'm amazed. It's like, oh wow, sometimes I say it's magic, and Deb says that's a ventral drop, as when I'm feeling I notice like, oh, I'm in dorsal. I don't want to do this task. I'm in dorsal. And as soon as I'm naming that and recognizing that, that dorsal state starts to shift, and it's just a feeling of recognition of, yeah, that's the, and I want to, you said it in the beginning of the call, feeling safe in the body, feeling safe in the brain, feeling safe within myself, which I think is quite an awesome thing. Anything you feel like you wanna end with?
I think that this is all really the relational neuroscience and polyvagal theory. And I think we just have to be, all of us, in book 2, all these people whose book I read, I reached out and said, oh, it's so much stuff. Can you tell me one thing? Like if you had one thing, I read this book called The One Thing, I loved it. And I said, if you have one thing for us, what would it be? So I start each chapter in book 2 with the one thing quote. So Deb Dana's one thing quote was always keep one foot in ventral. And I, to attempt to do that. And I think in education and parenting and in the world, if all of us can attempt to keep one foot in ventral, we're going to understand each other. We're going to create a kinder, more loving world. We're going to, nurture one another. I just think it's really important. And I like that image of one foot's in ventral. A lot of chaos is going on around me, but I know where those resources are. I know how to keep one foot in ventral and to get back to ventral, so that we don't have all these arguments about social emotional learning versus no social emotional learning. We have all these divisions going on. Come to the table, sit down, everybody, let's get one foot in ventral and let's talk about it. It's the way to move forward.
That's That's lovely. It's so many things coming up, but I know we're on the end. Thank you, Debra, so much. This has been really lovely. And I'm going to go back and read your book cover to cover, because there's so much in there that I didn't get from just kind of quickly reading it, but it's lovely. Thank you very much for your call, and hope to have more conversations.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
You too.